Hello, everybody. Welcome to this very special episode of the Fire These Times. It's a roundtable on Syria. As many of you may have noticed in the news, there's a lot going on in Syria. There's a rebel counteroffensive that has taken everybody by surprise, and they have recaptured Aleppo and large swaths of Aleppo countryside, as well as the south of Idlib, reaching almost to the gates of Hama. With that, a lot of resurgence of certain narratives and certain discourses that are, let's say very lightly, problematic, or at the very least, not helpful to understanding what is happening, situated within the context of the Syrian revolution. And we thought it would be good to sit around and talk about what's happening and provide a resource for people to understand what's happening with a sort of Syrian-centric perspective, obviously factoring in geopolitics, but also lived experience, also this coming 8 years after the fall of Aleppo, but also, 13 years into the Syrian revolution. And so we're four people from the Periphery Media Collective, and yeah, we're going to talk about that. If you're not a member of our Patreon, please become a member of our Patreon today to support this project. And that's all I'll say about that. So, yeah, I think first up, if anyone wants to start, I think Layla, if you'd like to talk about your reactions to what's going on and maybe a brief overview, because a lot is happening, and it is at a pace that, yeah, is very hard to keep up with.
Well, my first reaction, I think, like most Syrians, was absolute shock because this was so unexpected at this time. And we woke up to news that, rebels were advancing on areas that had been firmly out of rebel hands since 2020 in the northern Syria, where the negotiations between Turkey, Russia, and Iran kind of froze the power sharing agreement in northern Syria. So it was a shock that all of a sudden rebel forces, a coalition of rebel forces, and we'll talk a bit more later about who those are, um, managed to get into those areas and liberate that territory, and the speed at which regime forces crumbled, and there wasn't really any massive resistance to that. So the question is, why now? Why did this happen now? I think there's a number of factors which are external to Syria, which made this time possible. One factor is, of course, that the regime, which is a regime which is massively unpopular and is kept in power by foreign states, its foreign backers were significantly weakened. Russia is very much tied up in what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. Russia is very bogged down in Ukraine at the moment, and Iranian infrastructure in Syria has been completely decimated by Israeli airstrikes, including the Iranian proxy Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese Shia militia. So the regime was quite isolated, and I think rebel groups seized on that opportunity. By contrast, rebel groups seem to be much more organized and unified than ever before. I think a part of that is because so many groups have been forced into Idlib over the past years. In the areas
Mm.
which the regime has taken control, rebel groups were forcibly displaced into Idlib province, and maybe this could be a factor as to why there's now more unity amongst them. They certainly seem much better disciplined than they've been, and under a unified command. And they seem to have access to much better weapons. They've had drones now for a few months that really has empowered the rebels, because prior to that, they didn't have any form of aerial warfare. And then during this offensive, they've captured massive weapons stores from the regime when the regime forces fled. So yes, I think shock, that this is happening. And, it's really taken me a few days to kind of digest what's happening and what's going on. I think Syrians have very mixed emotions how they're responding to it. Many Syrians, both inside Syria and abroad, were celebrating because they hate the Assad regime, and this is the first major push against it for a long time, a successful push against it for a long time. But people are also very nervous and fearful of what might come in the future, both in terms of regime retaliation. We've already seen that the regime has been bombing Idlib and Aleppo. As always, it's not targeting rebel forces, it's targeting civilian communities, it's been targeting residential areas, hospitals, camps for displaced people. Many people have been killed, many more injured. In fact, doctors in Aleppo issued an emergency kind of appeal saying that they were really struggling with the influx and that they needed assistance to respond to the casualties. So, but on the ground, the regime forces haven't put up much of a fight. And then we've heard in the past 24 hours the entry of Iranian-backed Shia militias from Iraq. So we'll see how that changes the balance of power a bit on the ground.
Yeah, I think some of the images we're seeing or like developments are really hard to take in. It's just happening very quickly, and it's all very big and new, and I don't know how to describe it. But obviously, with that, there's yeah a great deal of trepidation, of hesitation, of fear, unsureness of where this leads. But with that, a lot of questions. And especially, I should have said this in the intro, that I think there's a lot of people for whom this might seem new. And a lot of our listeners, maybe, who have been joining us from like listening to our stuff on Palestine, and especially a lot of people also who have been kind of radicalized by what they've been seeing in Palestine and like entered into kind of political action. Um, I see, and a lot of them also are very young, a bit of confusion. And so I think there's going to be space here to talk about maybe some of those questions, maybe some of the misconceptions, some of the problematic narratives. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, what Leila already said. Um, Virtually every Syrian I know, for those who don't know, for quite some time, Syria was basically my world, even more than Lebanon and Palestine. Um, like they're expressing things between a combination of shock, both positive and negative. In some cases, at the very least, the negative was fear-based. Like, how can something this quick happen? Conspiracy theories are rife in our region. That's not anything new. And so many folks have I think, if not fully, but at least partly nestled in, into the stories that they're more familiar with. This is all Turkey, this is all Israel, this is all etc. etc. Some stories are more valid than others. I think fears over Turkey's role are very valid, very legitimate. But that being said, some of the rebels are very young. You mentioned like some of our listeners would be very young now and may not know, for example, 2016, let alone 2011. And it kind of sometimes baffles me that it's already been 8 years since the fall of Aleppo, almost to the day, because the fall of Aleppo was in Christmas, was December 2016. And we've seen photos of rebels who, I don't know how young they would be. I might best guess like 18, 19, maybe younger in some cases, who, had photos of them leaving Aleppo, being forcibly displaced in 2016. With we will be back to liberate our lands, that sort of stuff, and you have photos of them now, and so that's part of the emotional resonance is quite something to take in. The siege in 2016 was extremely brutal, very much compared to Reza, at the very least Reza in 2014, the first war, because at this point the scale of what's happening now in Gaza is difficult to compare to most things. But in 2014, I think it's a more accurate or more fair comparison. As to right now, the fears over what might happen next. I mean, the more obvious one is what's already happening, that the Assad regime in Russia will kind of step up their attacks. They do still have air dominance, and they will very likely always have that. The entrance of drones on the rebel side surely changes dynamics to some extent. To which extent, I don't know. It's very much to be seen. But it's certainly changing the extent. And it's also it's really pointing out to one really important thing that we have seen in Gaza as well, which is that the Israelis, for example, in Gaza, have difficulties dealing with, for example, Hamas when they're only fighting on the ground, when it's like more equal, quote unquote, or it's not even that obviously. And same South Lebanon, for that matter, if they were fighting Hezbollah on the ground, which is why they have air dominance, and this is what is 95% of what makes the difference here. And in Syria, we see this a lot as well. The Syrian regime basically was on collapse once, and then they needed the intervention of Iran and its allies. Then again, even with that, was on the verge of collapse a second time, and they needed the intervention of Russia. And Russia is the one that made the huge difference, obviously, in addition to what was already there.
I don't think they have the current capacity to have an intervention on the scale that they previously had. It looks like that. I mean, whether Iran is going to secure and Russia are going to secure what they see as their interests in Syria and focus on those areas which are very important to it, such as the corridor from Iraq to Lebanon, which Iran relies on.
Yeah, I mean, there's also I've been seeing some like new anti-air weapons that I've never seen before with some of these rebel groups, and some reports that even Warjet was shot down over Aleppo, which honestly is kind of my dream. Sort of putting myself somewhere, positioning myself already. Um, I don't know. The death from the air is something that all of us in the region experience in this kind of like brutal whatever. But before we get into it, and I want to get a bit into the kind of like how did we get here, slightly larger question, like historically. But I don't know if you'd like to share any sort of like reactions you had, or how you're reading the situation, where you're coming from, and the like.
Yeah, so from my position, I mean, I'm Armenian and I have lots of Armenian friends from Syria and Aleppo specifically, and I have a lot of contacts among the Kurdish community also, which itself has contacts in Rojava, or the autonomous administration of North and East Syria. And it's almost like you're dealing with a parallel universe with regards to these latest developments. The main forces on the ground for the Kurds, these are the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, primarily led by Kurdish elements, and the various forces under them. Their position has been deeply influenced, I think, by years and years of systemic oppression and cultural erasure of Kurdish communities prior to the revolution, the outbreak of the civil war after that. I I don't, they shouldn't be seen as pro-regime necessarily, but these developments are very kind of concerning, and all the minorities in Aleppo are also kind of specifically the Christian minorities and also Alawites are watching with trepidation. The situation so far seems calm but very tense. The HTS, and I think at some point we can probably go into who the SNA and HTS are. They have made in Aleppo public assurances that they won't kind of harm minorities, and again, specifically Christians. And early indications seem to suggest that that's kind of the situation right now. Although I do know of an Armenian who was recently sniped and killed in Aleppo, and I actually know their relative who lives in Armenia now. There are videos of older Christian Aleppans expressing that they feel safe. One says that she's, has her Christmas tree up. I just read this morning that Bishop Boutros Cassis of the Syriac Orthodox Church in Aleppo has stated that Christian leaders have coordinated and decided that they're going to stay. They're not going to leave the city. But despite these assurances, I think, the conversations again that I've been having with different people in Rojava and with Aleppans indicates that specifically like Armenians, Kurds, Assyrians, Yazidis do remain fearful. And in Aleppo right now, many are still afraid to leave their homes. They're not leaving. And their fear more than the regime or kind of reprisals or anything, because it's a completely different context, is the more extremist Islamist groups that they have, bad memories of. They have, troubling history with some of these factions, including the HTS, past alliances with ISIS, al-Nusra against the YPG in 2013, as well as involvement in the ethnic cleansing of Afrin in 2018, Ras Al Ain in 2019. So these groups pose a threat also because of the involvement and backing of Turkey specifically. So that is the main kind of bad guy, boogeyman, for these groups, and really for anyone who is opposed to pan-Turkism or Islamist supremacism. And these concerns are not hypothetical. They actually reflect tangible actions on the ground, even in the last couple of days. A massive Turkish flag was unfurled over the Aleppo citadel, which kind of signals to some degree, at least, Ankar's influence and ambitions, even though they might not be directly backing this kind of banner drop. We've also seen this hashtag Halab82. I don't know if you've seen this. This is circulating. It basically refers to Aleppo as Turkey's 82nd province. Turkey has 81 provinces, so that, Halab is this 82nd one. And, there are fears that this could mean the end of certain communities, Christian communities in Aleppo, because of that Turkish-backed element. If, they were to kind of completely take over control, they fear that they would be either, targeted for murder, disappearances, or, just ethnically cleansed from the city. And yeah, these are the same, especially, I mean, we can talk about SNA maybe separately, but that's another kind of element.
The Syrian National Army, or what is it called?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Syrian National Army, which is more overtly, directly backed by Turkey.
Yeah. Not to be confused with the Syrian regime.
The Kurds are in a particularly vulnerable position right now because it's anticipated that America may well withdraw its forces, which has been supporting the SDF in Syria. But I think it's also important to point out, and I didn't when I was talking about Syrian fears, is that many Syrians are also very fearful of the composition of these forces. They contain a lot of radical and extremist elements, and they certainly don't represent Syrians' aspirations or the values of the revolution.
It's important to point out that in the areas where HTS has already ruled, there have been multiple protests and demonstrations over the years. Notable activists have been assassinated as well, like that has happened. It is also true, not that, I mean, I don't think listeners will think I'm supporting them or anything, obviously, but I'll say that anyway, but they have changed on some level in the past few years. That is notable. It could be, as Leila mentioned, that I didn't think about this before, but the fact that everyone or most of the forces were in the same place, Idlib, obviously, for a number of years may have shifted things. Maybe they're more organized. The more extreme, reckless elements are pushed to the sides. It doesn't mean they're not there, but they're pushed to the sides. I would guess, this is just me guessing, that the Turkish flag, for example, over the citadel is one of the less organized elements, and the more organized elements is the ones that unfurled the Free Syrian and the Palestine flags, which we also saw on the citadel. And we saw, I think, on day one or day two, there was like some idiot that took down a Christmas tree, and the next day they put it back up. So clearly there is some kind of coordinated element. I've seen one of the speeches by Jolani himself, the leader of HTS, basically saying like, no one shall be harmed, all properties shall be preserved, etc., etc. At the very least, this seems to suggest that they're aware of bad PR. which is not nothing. It's something that can make a huge difference. A lot of the time, panic can ensue if you fear, rightly, for very good reasons, that you might be next, and them saying so openly that no, you're not next, no, you're safe, etc., is something. We will obviously say that, I mean, it's of course good that they bring up Christians. They usually don't bring up Kurds. It might be because they don't make the distinction between, because everyone is Sunni, blah, 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 in their eyes, but it's also a question mark. And more importantly, they don't bring up Alawites for the most part. Not all of them, but for the most part, they don't. I'm talking about HTS. Within people who are just there, the vast majority of people in any of those areas have nothing to do with HTS. It's not, they don't have a gigantic membership. I don't have numbers, like in the lower thousands, maybe, I don't know, thousands, but not like hundreds of thousands. And so those people are also the ones who protested against HTS. And some of those people would have very complicated feelings about what's happening now, celebrating the fact that a statue of Hafez al-Assad is being taken down, and the Syrian regime flag taken down, and some, they occupied, or they went into the mansion or whatever of that, the palace of, the Aleppo governor or whatever, and shit like that, while also being worried of what comes next, which is, for me, very understandable. I would have had similar fears about Hezbollah, to be honest, in the 90s. And I know of writers at the time that express very similar things to what we're hearing today, in a different context, but similar enough that it's worth mentioning at least. We mentioned HTS. What about the SNA? Who wants to explain them?
I think it would also be helpful because a lot of like the minority perspective that I'm looking at conflates the two. And
Yes.
like I, to some extent, like I know they're different and they're very different, but some people just insist like they're the same.
HTS, so what I can say about HTS, again, okay, I'm not gonna always preface this by saying I am not a fan, but whatever, is that they're locals. The HTS folks in Aleppo are from Aleppo. And there is clearly a familiarity to them. Even in those videos, I've seen that video you mentioned of that old lady. She wasn't talking to an HTS guy, she was just talking to a journalist. But the way she was talking about the HTS guy, she was calling them a shabab, like the guys, the youth even. Because many of them are young. Like, we really have to emphasize this. And clearly with a direct connection to Aleppo. For the most part, probably exiled in 2016, as many have, including those photos that we've seen of they were kids and now they're older and whatever. And that creates some kind of accountability to some extent. Again, all of this is very limited. It's still in context of war, but more so than like I take my orders from Turkey. It's a very distinct dynamic there. The SNA I'm less familiar with, other than I also don't like them, but maybe Layla, you can explain them more.
Well, the Syrian National Army was established, I think, in 2017, composed of former Free Army brigades that were backed and funded and trained and provided military support by Turkey. And they really seem to focus on a Turkish agenda, not a Syrian agenda. And that's been primarily to stop aspirations to Kurdish autonomy in the north, and also to create a safe area under Turkish control in northern Syria, where the refugees that Turkey no longer wants can be expelled back to. Now, whilst HTS seems to have gone on this massive drive to reassure minorities, it's even set up in Idlib and Aleppo emergency hotlines. If anyone suffers any abuses or there's security incidents, they can contact them. And it seems for now that, one, they're very concerned about popular opinion and getting popular support, and that they're trying to reassure minorities that they will be safe. On the other hand, the Syrian National Army has been focusing its fight on areas controlled by Kurdish forces, such as Tel Rifat area. And from what I've seen some horrific videos of abuses and humiliation of SDF soldiers that were carried out by these Turkish-backed forces. So at the moment, if we take HTS on its word face value, my main concern for ethnic conflict or sectarian backlash actually comes from these Turkish-backed forces.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's kind of the elephant in the room, the incoming Trump administration. What's going to happen with that? In many ways, I guess it doesn't seem to be directly okay. We don't know this 100% sure, and I guess we can't know whatever because Turkey isn't exactly transparent about these things. But it does seem to have taken the Turks by surprise. The actual the campaigns, the actual military campaigns, which is saying something.
It seems that they'd given the green light for some limited operation, but certainly nothing on this scale. And I agree with you. I think it completely took the Turks by surprise. In fact, on the first day, there were reports that Turks prevented the Syrian National Army from entering into Aleppo and joining the liberation of the city.
I also wanted to, sorry, can I just add a couple of things about an SNA and why Kurds are so worried? They were the ones with Turkish support who were responsible for capturing Afrin in 2018, and they reduced the Kurdish population from 90% to under 20% through systematic murder, torture. So you could also kind of see them as this broader kind of pan-Turkic project to reshape the demographics of northern Syria. And I wanted to also mention that it was these same forces or like fighters from some of these same forces who, again, coordinated by Turkey and Azerbaijan, sent at least 500 and possibly up to 4,000 fighters to target Armenians during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh war. So fighters from the SNA Sultan Murad and Al-Hamza divisions arrived in Azerbaijan and were involved in the fighting there. So this is, they have genocidal experience, and I would, I really do understand the trepidation around it. And yeah.
I think it's also important to point out that it's not just minorities that don't like the SNA. Syrians in general and the Sunni communities also have a lot of problems with the SNA because they have a reputation for corruption, they have a reputation for abuses, and they were constantly involved in infighting between rebels. In addition to that, Turkey, which was once seen as an ally of the revolution, has really fallen out of favor with Syrians for two reasons. One, because Turkey has been pursuing normalization with the regime, and secondly, because of the rise of xenophobic nationalism and attacks on Syrian communities inside Turkey. So none of the formations represent the interests of the majority of the Syrian people. And of course, as Karena has said, minorities in particular feel very vulnerable at the moment.
I've even heard Syrians describe them as like shabiha. Whatever, that term has actually been used to them and been accused of tashbih, which is a term that's usually used almost exclusively historically for, against the Assad regime. Even in Lebanon, it was specifically about the Assad regime.
Yeah. So I want to take a little bit of a step back for listeners that might be a bit unfamiliar with, how we got here. What are the sort of and that's a huge question, but I think it's important, and also important then to start discussing some of the narratives and some of the takes. Twitter, the hot takes, and again, I say takes, not analyses, because there's no analyses. But so let's situate this in a kind of historical process, which I think we can start with the Syrian Revolution, with the start of it in 2011. And I don't know, in the kind of broadest of terms, what are we seeing here? How is it connected to that? And what other kind of historical processes can we sort of lead us up to this moment?
Okay, so for a quick overview of the past decade and a half in Syria, well, the Syrian Revolution arrived in the context of a transnational revolutionary wave which was sweeping the region, which was called the Arab Spring. People saw the protests that were happening in Egypt, in Tunisia, and started to ask, why not here? Why not us? The Assad regime by 2011 had been in power for 4 decades, and it ruled Syria as a totalitarian police state. And any dissent against the Assad regime was severely repressed. Any political opponents were thrown into prison, torture was widespread. There was no political freedoms, there was no media freedoms, there was only like 3 state-controlled newspapers in the country. There was absolutely no space for any form of civil activism. In addition to that, Syrians had gone through a period of massive poverty, precisely because of the neoliberal policies which were brought in by Bashar al-Assad when he came to power, when his father died, which developed this kind of crony capitalism where people who were related to the regime, I should say it's a sectarian regime, it's a regime which is from the Alawi sect, which is a minority sect in Syria, and where people from that sect and family members of the Assad regime greatly benefited. So there was this very brutal form of crony capitalism that was practiced, and meanwhile subsidies that Syrians were reliant on for daily needs were slowly eroded, and life became more and more difficult economically. So there were real reasons within Syria why Syrians no longer wanted this regime, and people went to the streets and started protesting in 2011. The response from the regime was absolutely brutal. Like from the very early stages, the regime was shooting at people who were involved in protests. It was carrying out mass arrests of political dissidents and people involved in protests. It was carrying out rape campaigns in dissenting communities. And this level of brutality really galvanized Syrians who originally were calling for political reform, but then more and more and more people started taking to the streets and started calling for revolution. So that's the context of how the Syrian revolution arrived and why. And then over the years, of course, the response was more and more brutal. And people started to take up arms to defend themselves and their communities from regime assault. At first, this was like local neighborhood militias, but I think by July maybe of 2011, people started unifying under the Free Syrian Army umbrella. Now, the Free Syrian Army umbrella was never really a unified army under a unified command, but was a collection of these local militias who were all signed up to the twin aims of like protecting protesters from regime assault and resisting that, and trying to go forward to a democratic transition, which was what the goals of the revolution were. People wanted a democratic transition away from the regime. So, of course, the conflict escalated, violence breeds more violence, the reprisals started getting heavier and heavier on dissenting communities. But the Free Syrian Army had some successes and managed to liberate large swathes of Syrian territory. At one point, some 4/5 of the country were no longer under regime control. Now, the liberation of territory was amazing for Syrians, because what that meant was that civil activism could really flourish in those areas. And we saw, as the regime was pushed out, people set up local councils which were democratically administering to the needs of the community. They were running the healthcare system, the education system, water, food supply. And in addition to that, lots of other civil activism, lots of independent newspapers were set up. All these new ideas that people were coming to for the first time because of the revolution were debated, were discussed. Women started setting up women's centres all around the country to try to enable women to participate both politically and economically in Syrian life and participate in the revolution. So that was a very beautiful experience. When you talk to Syrians about the revolution, it's these things which had a huge meaning for them. It completely changed Syrians' consciousness and the way that they interacted with each other. Now, this was a revolution that wasn't just Sunni Muslims. It comprised men and women from all of Syria's religions, sects, and ethnicities, which was the greatest threat to the regime. Having a democratic alternative was what was the greatest threat, and that was why it was so absolutely viciously destroyed. And we've seen, you know, chemical massacres targeting hospitals en masse across the country, causing a very severe humanitarian crisis. The regime couldn't hold power on its own, and it was enabled to stay in power by the intervention of foreign states, both Iran and Russia, that have both given significant backing to the regime. Of course, economically and politically, they've shielded the regime, Russia specifically, from any levels of accountability through the Security Council. But they also, Russia gave the regime a great deal of air support. Russia has been targeting residential areas and hospitals throughout the years. And Iran provided the ground forces. And these were collections of Shia militias from all over the region, from Iraq, from Lebanon, from Iran itself, even from Afghanistan, that came to support the regime on the ground. And actually, if you look at Syria over the past years, you can actually talk about an Iranian occupation in Syria, because many communities across the country, when they were retaken by the regime, their population was completely forcibly dispelled. Many of them went to Idlib, as we previously mentioned. And we've seen over time that Iranians have been moving into those communities, or Shia from across the region have been moving into those communities, changing the demographic balance in a way in which the regime feels that it has support amongst the community. So there was the other factor that I think is important to talk about is that the Free Syrian Army never got any significant support, neither financial or militarily. There were dribs and drabs of support. For example, from America, used to send dribs and drabs of support, never enough to force the regime from power, but just to kind of force the regime to go to the negotiating table. After the attacks, the gas attacks in Ghouta, this was a very traumatic event for Syrians. I think Syrians realized at that point that they weren't going to get any major support. And this is when we really see the rise of Islamist battalions in Syria. Many of them, there's a whole range of Islamist battalions, from more moderate to really extremist, but the vast majority of them authoritarian and not really having anything to do with the original values of the revolution. And they increased in strength. They looked to the Gulf states for support and for funding. So this created a situation where there's lots of different militias in the country, lots of different warlords. The space for civil society activism decreased massively, also because of the mass arrests and people that were being tortured to death in Assad prisons, and also from the millions that fled the country into the refugee camps around the region or further afield to Europe. And so that's kind of the situation that we've been in a bit of a stalemate from for the past couple of years now. You know, a lot of the country came back under regime control, apart from Idlib and parts of northern Syria, which were divided amongst different power bases or different armed groups. And, you know, the economy is in absolute shutters. The regime runs the country as a drugs mafia. It gets all of its money today from the sale of Captagon, which is an amphetamine-like substance. And refugees have chosen not to go home. because they fear that if they do go home, they will be subject to arrest, which is absolutely the case with people that have returned. So they have stayed outside the country. And I think this is one of the reasons why so many people were hopeful by the events of the past few days. One, because there's a hope that people can return to Syria if land is liberated from the regime. And that's a massive thing, because that means that all the Democrats and civil society activists that were forced out of the country could return to build the country. Civil activism could resume in the country. And the second thing that made people very emotional, of course, was seeing the release of prisoners. People, the rebels in the past few days have liberated a number of prisons. People are reunited with their families. You can't imagine what an emotional thing this is for Syrians, because none of us have a situation where we don't have family or friends that are in regime prisons, you know. So this is a central, two central things for Syrians. One, they want to go home and rebuild their country. And two, they want the release of the prisoners. And that's why they've taken some kind of hope from what's been happening in the past few days.
Wow. No, thank you so much for that, Layla. That was a presentation.
I told you Layla would be better.
To put it mildly.
I've done it 1,000 times.
Every note that I had made of like, oh, I should ask that, you answered, and then I was like, okay, what
Yeah.
about then you answered. So I've got nothing. I think that does lead us up to the sort of present moment.
I would add something very quickly though, Ayman. The parallel to, I mean, basically adding to what Layla said, and she mentioned it towards the end, the scale of, I mean, you can kind of describe them as gulags, you can describe them as underground prisons, as whatever you want to call them, is I'm not gonna say unheard of around the world. I don't have the facts everywhere, but it's up there as among the worst in the world. We've seen footage. One man was released after 5 years, another one after 8 by the rebels. Was released, of course. One of the rebels himself was. There's a video of him kind of running across some field and hugging his father. And this is what I mean by like the big question is like whether rebels are locals or not. Not always, but like that's often a big difference. Many people, Syrians, were watching that video of the rebels releasing women and men from that prison in Aleppo with hope that their loved ones would be next, because many people don't know where they are, or if they do, they don't know. If they know the location of where their loved ones are, they don't know if they're alive. There's been a number of reports, obviously by number, I mean, it's in the hundreds. One of the most notorious ones, and I'll just use this as an example and then we can move on, is the Saydnaya prison, where the reports from, I think, 2017 or something by Amnesty International called it a slaughterhouse, because I think the number is like 11 or maybe 16,000 or something like this, people who were hanged in a matter of like a few months or a couple of years or something, like very small number of years. Through just mass hangings, so wholesale mass hangings. We've seen videos, of course, the Caesar files and other which are photos, but also videos of regime soldiers just mass executing people and throwing the bodies into mass graves. And those are just the ones that we've seen. We've obviously heard much more of survivors that have described horrors that are on a scale that, again, is very difficult to compare to most situations, but certainly up there as among the worst. And that has to. Folks who don't take that into consideration, just the scale of what we're talking about, that if you're like, I know, anecdotally, like a queer feminist, from a pretty privileged, originally in any case, background from Damascus, cheering on the HTS offenses. Those are not natural allies. Those are desperate. This is a situation of desperation. And that should be understood as like, how bad can a regime get? How bad does it have to be for people to at the very least say like, how worse can it get? Now we don't like this, but like, how fucking worse can it get? It's important to have this in mind.
Yeah, and I think it's very important just to raise, like, with the rise of the Islamist militias, to some extent there was support for them because they were fighting against the regime. They were seen as part of the opposition to Assad, but they were never seen as part of the revolution. And certainly when those militias became dominant in certain areas, there was a lot, as we've mentioned, public protest against them because of their abuses and because they were trying to implement a system of control that didn't resonate with Syrians. They had a very sectarian, very hardline religious ideology, which didn't match with the general population. So they were widely despised. But I think also what we didn't mention was the rise of ISIS, because ISIS appeared, the Islamic State, as a third force. This was neither part of the revolution nor part of the regime. They had an agenda that wasn't Syrian. Their agenda was to set up a global Islamic caliphate. And they also carried out horrific abuses against minorities, against anyone that dissented. But Syrians always saw ISIS and the regime as two sides of the same coin. They were against both of them. And of course, as we know, with the foreign intervention of Western states, ISIS was crushed, although it's now reorganizing in eastern Syria.
Yeah, Yasin Haj Saleh called them necktie fascists and bearded
Yes.
fascists.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, Ayman, go for it.
No, so I think if there is one thing that I would add, but I guess is a question that then will lead us up to what I think is an important point to hit on for this roundtable, which is hearing how you describe things, Layla, just now. Go to Twitter, it's a complete different shit show. It's a shit show. It's a complete different show. And
Or Instagram,
or all of it. They're just these
Yeah.
narratives that have, and especially for those listening, a lot of the accounts that people have been following, that people have been tweeting and retweeting, and unknowingly, and like a lot of us do this work of like calling out and being like, "Do you know who this person is?" Because we know these people who are very quote unquote good on Palestine. You might notice them now chiming in on what's happening in Syria and saying things that are very different to how we're discussing things. Saying their narratives are, and the history, it's all very different, and it's all very, this is a ploy. This is why now? Oh well, because like just after the ceasefire, with between Israel and Hezbollah, and we've seen these narratives before. We've seen them grow, but I think if anyone wants to take this, otherwise I'm happy to talk a bit about it, which is the parallel development of the Russian interference into Syria with its air force, but also with its propaganda machine. And I definitely was very conscious of this as it was happening in 2015. I noticed both those things escalated instantly. And with that, we're not just talking about RT, but a lot of different whatever, and it's sort of formulated what is kind of a coherent, I mean, it's not coherent in terms of like intelligible or like it's a good analysis, but there's like, they're all saying the same thing. There is a narrative that sort of has sort of an internal, like whatever, cohesion. So I don't know. If maybe again, if anyone wants to talk about the rise in 2015 of that propaganda, and then we can talk a bit more about yeah. I mean, I want to at least tackle head on. I think the core narrative or framework or takes that I've been seeing from again very big accounts, and to me, in my mind, they just sound like Zionists all of a sudden. And so, yeah, 2015 RT.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think it really changed with the intervention of Russia. And I think that's because much of the left falls into this campist framework of how it views anti-imperialism. It sees anti-imperialism, or it sees imperialism as only being carried out by the West, by the US, by Israel and its allies. And anything that that axis does is very bad. But on the other side, it sees other states like Russia and China and the Syrian regime as being anti-imperialist states. and makes excuses for the abuses that they carry out and discredits anyone that opposes them. So we saw, for example, when chemical massacres happened, chemical atrocities, many of these anti-imperialists on the left actually tried to excuse the chemical atrocities or deny them and pretend that they didn't happen. It's taken a stand whereby any opposition to Assad is constantly slandered, either as CIA agents, Zionists, jihadists, really using the worst kind of Islamophobic and war on terror language. And that's the situation that we're in. Unfortunately, there's many people who are very prominent in the pro-Palestine movement that have this worldview. And whilst their politics on Palestine have been good, there's a complete double standard into how they respond to what's happening in Syria. And unfortunately for us as Syrians, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, but the US is not our main enemy. Our main enemy is the regime and the imperialist powers which are supporting that regime and carrying out mass atrocities at the Iranian and Russia states. And as has been mentioned, well, both of them to some extent, but specifically Russia, has a very powerful propaganda arm, and its propaganda arm has not really been to dispute things with an alternative explanation, but really to bombard and pollute the public space with so many different narratives that no one can really work out what is going on, who to support. It's a messy situation.
Yeah, it's like that book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible by Peter Pomerantsev. That's kind of the playbook. Well, I would say I just add a few things if that's okay. Before we started recording, I said that, like, because we were obviously preparing like what we were going to talk about and stuff, and I was like, I'm worried that I'm gonna be exhausted by the end of this, just because Layla and I, and Ayman and I, Karen and I as well, to a different extent, but like Layla and I basically met in this context effectively on like ranting about campus and tankies online and shit like that in London almost 10 years ago now. And some of the same actors are still around, some of the literally same faces are around with even bigger budgets now. I don't blame people who find themselves in a, like if they were following a bunch of accounts, which is how things happen these days, unfortunately for our species, I think, then, suddenly those accounts are pushing a different narrative, or let's say, more or less coherent narrative on Syria. Well, I've trusted them on Palestine. Why would I not trust them on Syria? I get that. And I don't believe it's a misinformation problem more than like meaning badly or whatever. The problem is that, in effect, it kind of causes the same amount of damage regardless. And I even stopped calling we said good on Palestine. I would, whatever, this may be a nuance or like quibbling over detail, I would just say like anti-Israel. They're anti-Israel, fine. Which is, when Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, it's good to be anti-Israel and fine. And even like 99% of the time, I'm fine with that. There's no problem. The problem is that it's not relevant if you're from Yarmouk. It's not that if you're from Yarmouk, it's not relevant to be anti-Israel. It is. But if the Assad regime is the one that's exterminating your camp, as happened, over a decade ago now, more or less, then your main problem is Assad. And for me,
just to jump in to explain that Yarmouk is a Palestinian refugee camp on the outskirts of Damascus.
And the largest of the diaspora before the Assad regime destroyed it. For me, as someone who knows a bit too much about the Assad regime, even including in Lebanon, the Assad regime's role when it comes to Palestine has been, at best, abandoning the Palestinian cause, abandoning the Golan Heights, at worst, intervening in Lebanon in 1976 on the side of the Christian far-right in order to crush the Palestinian resistance and their Lebanese allies. And of course, in 1982, while the Israelis were like a few months apart, and while the Lebanese, but backed by the Israelis, were committing the massacre in Sabra and Shatila, the regime was committing the massacre in Hama. And they've done this time and time and time again. Same fucking year, 1982. This has happened multiple times. The regime and the Assad regime and the Israeli regime, whatever, the Israelis and the Assadists, whatever we want to call them here, have a lot of things that are similar. They have a lot of things in common in terms of tactics, in terms of obsession with crushing any kind of Palestinian dissent, when the only Palestinian that they like is basically a docile one who doesn't complain about, who say like, I am a Palestinian Israeli and I like Israel. That's the extent that the Israelis are happy with. The Assad regime is the same fucking thing. It's fine to be a Palestinian in Syria, no problem, as long as you shut the fuck up. So for me, it's like two parallel universes, but not for good reasons or understandable reasons, like the parallel universe that Karina was describing initially. If you're a Kurd from Rojava and your main fear right now is the Turkish regime, well, you in some ways you're in a parallel universe, and maybe some of your quote unquote analysis or whatever might be off sometimes, sure, but all of us have this problem. That's just a subjective human experience, but it comes from a positionality of pain and fear and whatnot, which I'm not gonna judge. I'm not in that position. But that's not the case of the Assad regime. That's not the case. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a now 5 decades old dynasty of first the dad and now the son that have done absolutely everything humanly imaginable to stay in power for whatever cost. And this is the situation we're in. If we don't start not to repeat myself too much, but if we don't start our analysis on Syria, starting with Syria, not with fucking geopolitics, not with Iran and Israel and Turkey and America, whatever. Those we include those at some point, but start with Syria. What is it? Where is it? Who's ruling it? What is that regime's politics and whatnot? What are we doing if we don't do that?
It's such a racist discourse because it totally denies Syrian any agency at all. Everything that happens is always the result of foreign powers. And yes, foreign powers have intervened and are intervening and are going to intervene, but not everything that happens starts and ends with foreign powers. Syrians also influence events. And as we've seen in the past few days, United Syrian forces have influenced events quite significantly. The question now will be to what extent foreign powers try to take advantage of that.
And allow them to exist as an alternative. We had a period of time when the liberated areas were sort of allowed to be that way. Same for Rojava. In the case of I don't like these terms, well, whatever. Like, let's say Aleppo, Eastern Aleppo specifically, which was a liberated area, was allowed partly because there was the threat of Turkey and Assad, and they were doing whatever in terms of geopolitics. And with Rojava, it was at least partly, or to some extent, the Americans being on the ground, providing at least some kind of buffer against the Turks. But that doesn't mean that if you know that the Americans are there and you know that means the Turks can do whatever they want, that doesn't mean that you deny the importance of Rojava. Doesn't mean you deny the importance of that experiment and that revolution in many ways and whatnot. Doesn't mean you just recognize that they're in a shitty situation and they've tried to, well, the more progressive among them have tried to do their best with that shitty situation. And Syria right now, the armed forces are not the progressive or whatnot, but there are Syrians who are just there, civilians who are just there in their hundreds of thousands, many of them are liberals and progressives and leftists and whatnot. They don't have the guns because this is the world we live in. But it doesn't mean that they're not there, and it doesn't mean that we get to erase them just because they don't have the guns. And one thing I find baffling about this discourse is that it's effectively it's a war on terror discourse. We see the Israelis calling Hamas terrorists, and we see a bunch of people, understandably and rightly so, say stuff like, well, this is a Islamophobic war on terror from the Bush era doctrine and shit like that. And then 5 seconds later, they're calling all of the Sunnis who have a beard and have guns, calling them takfiris. Like, it's the same fucking, what's the difference? What is the difference? That on the one side you have Westerners saying it, and then, sorry, I'm ranting now.
But then also conflating absolutely everybody, including civilian populations, with those groups.
Yeah.
And so basically all these people, regardless of if they're concerned with things like HTS are legitimate and whatever, but they're completely silent when Russia is bombing civilians in that same way and I find this frustrating, but it's this hypocrisy that we know has existed for a very long time. But I think and I hope we are in a slightly different phase. I think there are a lot more people plugged in. You remember, Elia, I asked you, or we were talking a few months ago, and the way I described, we've been in this group chat for in this sort of in the region experiencing whatever, and then 40,000 people join this group chat, and they're oh, we're here now, what do we do to free Palestine? And so yeah. I have a bit more energy these days to try to address those people. I don't like I've shown all of you, like the only thing I ever respond to Asad Abu Khalil, I just sent him that picture of the graffiti where someone said painted in Lebanon, called khara, like Asad Abu
Is that
Khalil
is
eat
that is
shit.
that is that too niche?
Just he's a tanky, he's a campus, but that's the point. Or like anytime when any of the names, any of the Blumenthals and the Khaliks and whatever, to them, I just spit in their face. I just write whatever, shut up, you're a genocide denier, like no one should listen to this person, but to the people who are posting them and not knowing, I think, hopefully, I slightly more benefit of the doubt and slightly more conversations. But that's what I think is useful for us growing from the periphery to be establishing like a full. Because again, I'm not really trying to convince anyone when I tell Asad Abu Khalil to eat shit. I'm definitely not trying to convince him, and I'm not trying to convince anyone below. But yeah, especially like new people, but also people who have been radicalized by scenes of civilian populations being absolutely massacred by uh, jets, by war jets, who they have nothing to defend themselves. And so here we just see the same situation. But also, or I mean, 10 years ago, we were seeing this on the daily. There was a very painful thing that I know Layla's talked a lot about, but a lot of Syrians have talked about. And it's very hard. You never really want to correct someone because everything in the last year has been just absolutely atrocious and horrible in Gaza. But when people describe it as the first live stream genocide, it's not. And so many of the images, obviously, it has gone above and like beyond, but um, we see those images. We saw those images 10 years ago.
Oh, we saw images from Syria that were confused as being from Gaza as well. Like
This
that
this
also
was the
happened.
second point, yeah, which is so we were seeing these images for years in the mid 2010s, and but yes, now there is that chief hypocrisy where people who were championing the Assad regime while he was, or at best, and again, I want to be clear here for the audience, we all know this, um, but that even when people say Assad is a butcher, he is a murderer, he's a dictator, but this is part of Assad denial, like sort of denialism and apologio, and this is the main thing I'm seeing. Like even people like Rania Khalid can never say like, no, no, he's great. But the line is, and I do stress the thing that it's a line, um, that he's bad, but the alternative is worse. And again, like you're saying, Layla, that not just in the analysis that it should start with like what are Syrians saying, but they're the main ones who are experiencing it. So what does this
And
mean for the Syrians? But like
that's a
instantly,
total that's
yeah,
a total erasure of us. There's a total erasure of the fact that there was a massive radical democratic experiment that went on for years in Syria. That's the alternative. That's always been the alternative, and it's still the alternative today.
yeah, no, 100%. But where I was going with that was a bit more of like, I've seen a lot of Lebanese reactions to it, and it's almost instantaneously, what does that mean for us? Like, oh, shit's happening in Halab. What does that mean for us? Oh no, it's HTS. What does that mean for us? But there's not like a minute where it's like, well, let's listen to Syrians. What does this mean for them? What's happening? Because they're the primary people who are going to be affected by this shifts. But the geopolitical concerns trump the actual lives, and that is a fundamentally racist discourse. Um, Here's the thing. I have some questions, or I have a question, but I am very aware that you have spent the last 10 years answering this question, and it's frustrating. And Elia, you were just saying how exhausted you are because, yeah, we have been having this conversation a lot.
Yeah, but I need it's okay. Like it needs to, otherwise it's just in my head, which is not helpful.
So yeah, the main thing I think is seeing this within the lens of a kind of geopolitical play. So I don't know if you can talk specifically against or towards the claim that the rebels are being funded by Israel, that which connects. I know. I'm sorry. I did have to just because I know that's going around, but also because within that narrative is why would Israel fund these rebels? Well, because the regime is part of the resistance against it. So it connects to all that, and so I think we should talk about it. I'm so sorry to have to ask this question.
I don't know. I can do this quickly if you want. Where are the fucking Golan Heights? Where are they? Where are they? Okay, I know it's rhetorical here, but they're annexed by Israel, and they've been annexed by Israel since the 80s. Smotrich was fucking born in the Golan Heights, one of the leaders of the far right in Israel. Yeah, he was. What has been done concretely by the Assad regime to liberate the Golan Heights? The answer is absolutely nothing, not a single thing. In fact, in 2011, during the uprising, one of the popular chants was basically, "Why are you directing the tanks towards us? The Golan Heights is that fucking way."
Yeah.
You know, that was basically it, and people were aware of this because why wouldn't there be? It's a good chunk of Syrian territory that was annexed in the 80s, occupied since the 70s or 67 obviously, but annexed in the 80s. And that's it. That was the end of it. The Golan Heights are done as far as the Assad regime is concerned, of course. And again, concretely, what has been the role of the Assad regime towards Palestine? Concretely, beyond having a flag here and there, beyond that, or one of the branches where they torture people, they call it the Palestine branch. Beyond that, what was it? I mentioned 1976, which included the Lazata massacre against Palestinian refugees, by the way, for listeners. And I mentioned 1982 with the Hama massacre, obviously, but Yarmouk is much more recent. And we even did a couple of episodes on this podcast, one with Muhammad Sulaiman, who grew up in Gaza, talking about the Assad regime being insanely unpopular in Gaza. It's nowhere near what people seem to be imagining in that parallel universe on social media. But also Nidal Bitari, I believe was the name of the guest, who grew up in Yarmouk, talking about like the very specificity of being a Palestinian Syrian growing up in Yarmouk and being heavily obviously aware of the Assad regime early on, and of course aware of where you are from, or your parents are from, grandparents are from, whatever, i.e. the Israeli state, and always making the parallel between the two, always making the link between the two and how similar they are, and kind of taking that for granted, and then having this weird almost out-of-body experience when you go online and you see people actually saying that the Assad regime is resisting Israel somewhere on some planet, not on this one, not for the past 4 decades.
But the route from between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Like I think
sure, but then Hezbollah went to the east, which, as far as I'm concerned, is not where Jerusalem is. But the thing is, like, this is, man, there's so many different layers to this. You tell me if this is helpful. But a regime that crushes people cannot liberate people. And if we don't take this almost as like 101, I generally, again, sorry for repeating this, like, what are we doing? What is happening here? You know, not in this space right now, but like, where is this liberation gonna happen? Syria, he lost Syria 4/5, as Layla mentioned, because of Syrians. Syrians took to the streets against him, and he lost because he just did not have the popular legitimacy. He needed 2, arguably 3, if you count Hezbollah as a separate one from the Iranian one, intervention to just be propped up. And in the meantime, how did he do that? By selling off a bunch of different assets to the Russians and to the Iranians, and allowing the Iranians, for example, to also basically do ethnic cleansing in large parts of Syria. Like, what is this guy going to do for Palestine? Like, I don't, sometimes like it's so blatantly absurd that like I feel, as you can see, probably, I mean, the listeners won't see me move as much, but like, it's just, I don't know what people are talking about. I mean, I know where they're bringing, because I know Layla and I know campism, and I've I'm now educated and well versed in like this anti-imperialism of fools or whatever. But in terms of like concrete usefulness, I know more Palestinian Syrians, either personally or indirectly or through acquaintances or whatnot, who have been either forcibly disappeared or tortured, or their parents have been forcibly disappeared or tortured, or relatives or whatnot, by the Assad regime, than I know Palestinian Syrians activists on the left or whatnot who are pro-regime. Because why the fuck would they be? The regime crushed unions, destroyed the communist movements, imprisoned and tortured them and whatnot. And this is the legacy. It's like, for me, being surprised that like someone in, I don't know, Ramallah or Gaza is not a fan of Netanyahu. Why would I be surprised by that? It's like, Sorry, yeah.
connecting with the narrative, just to say, then it's also therefore like the Assad regime is not a threat. Like the Israelis do not see it as a threat because it is not a threat and it never has been a threat.
The most peaceful border Israel has had since like the 80s.
Yeah. Wow, yeah, that's
But
true actually.
another question, just stepping back a bit, is why are people prioritizing states of which to give solidarity to? Like, where are the people in this discussion? The people that are struggling against their states, the people that are struggling for liberation, the people that are struggling for better social and economic conditions. You know, those are the people that we should be supporting, not saying which state is involved. Oh, should I support this state? Is that a good state or is that a bad state? I mean, the question's bullshit. Like, where are the people in this analysis? Those are who we should always be looking for people that we can support, who are our people on the ground. And there's always people on the ground that you can identify with and extend solidarity to.
And we have no problem doing that when it comes to Palestine, where there is no state. Effectively, we have no problem doing that where like we have a state that is being opposed to the Israeli state. There is technically a state of Palestine, but that's not what we're thinking about or talking about when we're saying, you know, stop bombing Gaza, or from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, or free Palestine, or stop apartheid. We're not thinking about the state of Palestine. We're just thinking about Palestine. We're thinking about the Palestinians, the Palestinian cause. For the life of me, I mean, again, I can put on this analytical hat on and go through the campism and the theoretical flaws. And, you know, we had Rohini Hensman on, and we had an episode with Leila was also on it with Daniel Kurd and Romeo Kochiatsky talking about this anti-imperialism from the periphery and whatnot. And I can do that, and that can be, you know, that is important. And maybe we can link those episodes because we're not going to get into them to the same extent. But like fundamentally, I just think of like, I know people, you know, like when the scenes of the prisoners were being released, I immediately messaged Wafa Mustafa, who was on this podcast, whose father has been forcibly disappeared for what, a fucking decade now or something. I thought of Yassin Haj Saleh, whose wife Samira has been forcibly disappeared, not even by the regime, by Jaish al-Islam, almost a decade ago now or something. I don't remember. Like, and those are the stories that if we don't center them, like we center Hind Rajab, we center all of the Palestinian activists and writers and kids and whatnot, because why wouldn't we? Sure, you had people, you know, centering and even romanticizing Sinwar when he was assassinated because of like that shot of the drone. But for the most part, most people, when they've been thinking of Gaza, they've been thinking of that kid. And they've been thinking of, you know, that professor who was assassinated, or that poet, or that whatever. Syrians don't have those. Syrians don't have kids. You know, I think a lot about Bana, if you guys remember her.
Yes.
Bana al-Abed in 2016, because there was an insane amount of propaganda against her, calling her AI. She's not real. She's fake. She was whatever it is.
Managed by handlers, wasn't it?
Managed by handlers and whatnot, even though like basically her mom was helping her tweet was basically what happened. And I mean, I've interviewed her. But we have kids today in Gaza also tweeting and posting and live streaming on Instagram or whatever, what's happening around them. And that discourse doesn't exist except on the Israeli side. They call it Pallywood. They call it Palestinian Hollywood. Why is this different than the people who said that in 2011 the uprising or the revolution in Syria was created in some studio in Qatar? Why is that different? It's the same fucking thing. It's just, it happens, it's different actors kind of using the same language against more or less different people. And in some cases, not even different people if you're a Palestinian Syrian. You're being talked about in the same way by the Assad regime and by the Israelis and their apologists because you're Palestinian, who happen to also be from Yarmouk or whatever. Like for me, if we don't start from that, again, this analysis of power, of authoritarianism, of like all of that shit, if we don't include all of that, then we're playing Risk, you know, which is fun to play when you're a teenager, but like that's not the real world. There are people involved in all of this. And I'm gonna end my TED talk here. Sorry.
I wanted to kind of bring together a couple of these strains of thought that we've been talking about, especially regarding like power and anti-imperialism, because, you know, in the beginning I was talking about minorities as this kind of like parallel universe, but they're not. They live, okay, again, I don't want to get into the statist kind of definitions of Syria, but they do live, you know, in the same kind of arguably some kind of way, political entity, the same one. But, you know, and I'm generalizing minorities because they're very, you know, different. Obviously, they're not a monolith, but the Kurds largely, are anti-imperialist. Their project is very anti-imperialist and it's not statist. And then you have some of the other minorities in Aleppo who they're not necessarily fans of Assad. They were okay and kind of preferred to keep their head down to kind of just keep going. But is that sustainable in the long term? And I just kind of wanted to rhetorically maybe pose this question of, there's these discourses, these positions are so separate and they don't speak to one another. And it's almost like they consciously avoid, acknowledging one another. What are the obstacles to that? Why is that happening? And what are other ways that could look?
Do you mean why the unity that we spoke about previously at the beginning of the revolution broke down?
Maybe not so specifically, even more broadly, why, it's
Like,
kind of that,
what can be done? What can it look like?
maybe kind of, drawing on that idea. I still haven't read that piece in Antidote Zine about, Kurdish Arab rapprochement, or Layla, what you and I had once spoken about, the Kurdish revolution in Rojava wouldn't have been possible without the Syrian revolution and the Syrian revolutionaries, and how, so many, especially Western observers, romanticize the Kurdish project as this, it's the first kind of this, egalitarian feminist, movement in the Middle East, whereas, Syrian revolutionaries were doing the same without kind of erasing the well-grounded fears of these communities and their experience.
Yeah,
How do you reconcile? It's so difficult. It's a question it's a constant question in my mind, and I don't know how to even approach it.
I guess if we talk about what's more ideal, maybe we start from a theoretical, more abstract or whatnot. But I would not say it's impossible. It's just extremely difficult for largely geopolitical, for lack of a better term, reasons. But there is such thing as a Southern Front, which is inactive right now. But as far as I know, this is from memory because it's been a while now, was multi-ethnic and secular. The big question right now also is what happens with Sweda, because Sweda is a big question mark because it's an autonomous region within technically regime-held territories, but they're very much not fans of the regime. There are regular protests, including flying waving, the Free Syrian flag and whatnot. I would ideally see some kind of rapprochement between forces in the south, which are maybe have more, because for different reasons, bordering Jordan, for example, or whatnot, don't have the same kind of pressures from Turkey, right, or shit like that, or from Iran for that matter, and have been able to do things a bit more like the early days of the revolution, not quite the same, but a bit more than what revolutionists like rebels and whatnot had to deal with in 2016 in Halab or Aleppo, and certainly than today. And some kind of reconciliation, a serious one, political reconciliation between, I don't want to use the acronyms. I don't want to say the FSA and the SDF because what can that even look like in a year or whatever, but between the components that form those original parties or movements or whatnot. And again, not original in the sense that we need to go back in time 10 years because that's done, that's in the past. But I don't see any other path forward that's good for Syria. There are alternatives and scenarios and even more likely scenarios that are all bad, and that's what's currently happening. But in terms of a more progressive vision or whatnot, it's a version of the Rojava project, or Rojava project for that matter, obviously continues to exist as it is without Turkey doing what Turkey has been doing for a long time. And the rest of Syria going back, or at least recreating the original forms of the local councils, and those two linking up because they are more similar than not. It's just the local councils were destroyed by the Assad regime. Omar Aziz, one of the leading thinkers, died in prison and held by the Assad regime. That's what I would like to see in terms of how to get there. There's a lot of bad blood, or I don't know if that's the correct term in English, but an animosity and lack of trust, which is understandable. And that lack of trust is easily manipulated as well and preyed upon by the wider powers, whether it's the Assad regime and its Russian and Iranian allies, or whether it's Turkey, and those two specific examples.
Yeah, and also, of course, by the Free Army Forces, the Turkish-backed militias, the
Oh yeah.
SDF. I mean, the decisions that they've taken have been decisions that haven't worked in the interests of Syrian unity. And I think, we need to come to a realization that our liberation and our freedom is very much tied up with the liberation and freedom of the other, whether that's Arabs and Kurds, whether that's Syrians and Palestinians. The whole issue for the whole region is democratization. If we had a democratic Middle East, the Gaza genocide would have been finished by now because the states would have acted to reflect their population's wishes, you know?
Finished, you
So
mean stopped?
finished, stopped, I don't know. I think if we were in a democratic Middle East, we would be in a very different situation. I mean, Saudi could have such a big influence on ending the genocide in Gaza just by turning off the oil tomorrow.
Yeah.
I think its population would support that, but these
Or
leaders are not
Egypt or
acting,
Jordan. Oh
or
yeah.
Egypt or Jordan. These leaders are not acting in the interests of the people. So I think, we have to start thinking, how can we work together, people to people solidarity, to really build a movement to take us forward to a different future.
Yeah. No disagreements there. And maybe we should stop calling everyone terrorists. Maybe we should just give that up. Like, just stop doing that. I mean, Daesh terrorists, I don't care. Go for it. And even it just Hezbollah calls all of the FSA, all of the Syrian terrorists. The SDF calls all of the other Syrian terrorists, and the HTS people and people in Idlib and Aleppo call the YPG and YPG obviously in SDF, and they call them all PKK anyway. They call them all terrorists.
Yeah, it's not only the war on terror language that we need to move away from, it's the Islamophobic language that we need to move away from. Any group that has any sort of religious name or religious goal is just put in the extremist bracket. And Syria was never a revolution between secularism and religion. That wasn't what the dividing line was. The dividing line was between democracy and authoritarianism. Many people in Syria are religious, but they can organize themselves under a religious framework democratically. Many people will support that. But yeah, any kind of hint of Islam coming in is instantly discredited or brushed aside.
And yet, the second largest group in Gaza is called Islamic Jihad, and no problem. It's okay. We can be nuanced. Not Hezbollah call their people Mujahideen, no problem. We can be nuanced. But Syria breaks people's brains. Sorry,
But I
this is
agree.
not helpful, but
But I agree with the term terrorist because it's just the term for the baddie because it's never something you do, it's always what they do.
of course.
And
And that's what George W. Bush himself said. If you're not with us, you're with the terrorists.
yeah,
Maybe we should just reserve the term for states, like
yeah.
terrorist states. I can get on board with that.
Yeah.
What I like, I feel like we're wrapping up. Those are all very great concluding questions, sort of statements.
Have we, Karina, one sec, Karina, because you are like our moderating force as well. Anyway, have we talked about the quote unquote minority question? Have we dealt with it fairly? Because it's not an easy one
It's
to
not
do
an
it
easy
fairly.
one. I honestly, I don't know. I don't
Okay,
know,
well, fair enough.
but I think we're doing the best we can.
This
Yes,
doesn't have to be
please
the
do,
only one,
sirs.
but I did want to add one thing. Actually, like not wrapping up yet. But what I find frustrating about some of these narratives is that they don't provide, again, tanky campus narratives, some of these very sensationalist ones you see online, that they don't hold an analysis and they don't hold it in, like it's not thorough. And this is why none of them ask you to like read about Syria. It's just look at this take. And again, different from Palestine, watch this film, read this poem, listen to this song, read this book. But all these takes on Syria, all these people producing these takes, do not say read this for a thing. It's just read this one weird article or just read Noam Chomsky and nothing else. And so, like you said, Elia, I don't like using this term terrorist. It is a pure ideological term. And what I find frustrating is some of these people try to claim power by saying, no, now you're the terrorist, you know? like we have been as Arabs for decades described as terrorists. And so there's this sort of feeling of, well, no, actually, now I'm going to call you the terrorist. And it's like literally the idea of using the master's tools. And I just don't see the power in that at all. And I see that sort of just, and again, not just using the term specifically, but on also the whole package that comes with it, the narrative and the ideology. Because we're not gonna war on terror ourselves out of the war on terror. And so doing the bullshit that the Zionists do vis-a-vis Palestine and Palestinians, as in erasing the Palestinians and literally and ontologically or epistemologically rather, that like they don't exist and they can only exist as these vague entities, like Hamas. Oh, it's Iran, you know? There are no Palestinians. This is Iran coming and using these people and, you know, justifying the kind of the human shields logic. It's sad that children are being killed in Gaza, but Hamas. And so you'll see the same thing by people who condemn one with Syria will do, okay, children being killed by Russian air warplanes. It's sad. And again, this is the best they can do. For the most part, they'll be silent about these things. But if they ever say it's sad, but HTS, but Israel or something, and some fantasy, whatever. And I think both are condemnable, not just the attacks, but also the apologia for those attacks. And I really, really hope that a lot of these people who have been radicalized and whose hearts bleed and who have been so shaken by what we've been seeing in Gaza the last year, that these people will have that sort of, at the very least, emotional consistency and at best, like the political consistency, that all of this comes from the struggle, from a struggle for liberation. That even though it's manifested very differently at this point, 13 years on, but so we are still seeing a counter-revolutionary war. And none of it will really end without those core issues of the revolution being addressed, i.e. the overthrow of Assad.
Nothing can begin without the Assad regime ending. I mean, whatever comes now, it's going to be a mess. Syria's completely been devastated and destroyed. The country's run by warlords. There's so many foreign powers involved. But Assad going is a prerequisite to even start talking about a day after or what comes next.
All right. I think that was a really productive, really interesting and exciting and just, I don't know, I loved that conversation. It was what I'd hoped and more. And I hope everyone listening, is there anything else anyone wants to add or share or reflect on?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, we don't know what's going to happen over the coming days, weeks, and months. But what we do need to be doing is supporting people on the ground that, are still there, still want to live a safe, peaceful life. They want some kind of democratic future. Those are the people we should be looking for and we should be supporting. And certainly we should be condemning the violence and abuses of states, whether that's the Assad regime, whether that's any state that's involved, and really, have much more of a human-centered focus on what we're doing.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you everybody for listening. This has been another episode of The Fire These Times. Thanks guys for joining, and this was a great conversation. To end, if you want to support this podcast, please consider heading on over to patreon.com/fromtheperiphery and become a member for as little as $5 a month. With that membership, you not only support us so we can do more conversations like this, but you also get exclusive access to great content like my exclusive sub-series, Keep This Between Us, where I tell funny stories from my life because a lot's happened. But also early access to the other podcasts and wherever
Maybe
you
it's
listen.
a good time to plug that myself and Elia are soon going to be starting a podcast series focused solely on Syria. So we'll be able to go into depth a lot more on these issues.
Good fucking timing, unfortunately.
That wasn't planned like that,
It was not
But-
planned. No.
But yeah, so if you support us through Patreon, then you help make that project work and develop. I can be a good marketing
And-
guy. You guys should exploit that more.
I would add, like, this podcast and project is sponsored by Iran Rohak Ya Hafiz,
Yes.
but that's only for the Arabic speakers. I just said curse your soul, Hafiz. That's all I said.
Leave a rating or review wherever you listen to this podcast. And most importantly, tell your friends and stay safe. So yeah,
Thanks, Ayman.
that's it.
Excellent, guys.